Hi everyone, okay, it's time to continue the series on Bobby Fischer's 60 memorable games. Here he has the black pieces against the brilliant Estonian player Paul Keres, who's considered by many to be the strongest player who never became world champion, having narrowly missed a chance at a title match on 5 occasions. This was played at the Candidates Tournament in Bled, Slovenia in 1959. It's entitled Too Many Cooks, and Larry Evans gives the introduction as follows. Professionals spend much of their time hunting for cooks, with which they hope to surprise future opponents. It was rumoured, for example, that Marshall waited for over 10 years before springing his famous gambit on Capablanca at New York in 1918. But, as it happened, the wily Cuban refuted it over the board. Keres, in like manner, confronts Fischer with an innovation which the latter, in all innocence, proceeds to destroy. It's important to remember also that Fischer was only in his mid-teens when this was played, whereas Keres was a seasoned professional in his early 40s, so there would have certainly been a psychological element involved as well. As usual, however, tactics such as these had zero effect against Fischer's ruthless logic, which you'll see as the game evolves. To get into it anyway, Keres had the white pieces and opened with e4, to which Fischer replied c5, going into the Sicilian defense and his favorite variation of it after the book moves. Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and a6, the notorious Najdorf variation, perhaps the sharpest and most explored opening in all of chess history. Even today, especially with the advent of engines, this opening is still providing new creative scope for both sides. The famous book Modern Chess Openings, which gives all the variations of all the openings, refers to the Najdorf as the Cadillac of chess openings. It's named after the Argentinian grandmaster Miguel Najdorf, and the move a6, which black has just played, stops white from using b5 for his pieces and prepares a minority attack on the queen side with the pawns, aiming both to generate initiative against white's e4 pawn here and pressurize the white king, who will castle on the queen side fairly often in Najdorf situations. Play continued along one of the many book lines with bishop g5, which is threatening to double black's pawns here. So e6 stops that threat, and now f4 threatens e5 and the winning of the pinned knight here on f6. And there are a few ways for black to deal with that threat, and at this early stage of his career, Fischer usually played bishop e7, which is what he played in this game, but in later years he almost invariably played queen b6, which can lead to the poisoned pawn variation if white chooses to go down that path. And he mentions in My 60 Memorable Games this opening and refers to it as being sharp, and adds that he'd tried it on several occasions. Presumably he hadn't analysed the resulting lines enough to trust it completely in 1959, but from the early 60s onwards it was a regular in his opening repertoire. The pin on the knight here at f6 is solved, and white will often sacrifice the b2 pawn here in order to get a lead in development and hope to prove that black's early queen excursion is ill-advised. If black survives the attack without losing material, not only will he be a pawn up, but he will have isolated two of white's pawns for the endgame, the a and c pawns here, and as a result he should have winning chances in an endgame where white has two isolated pawns like that. And remarkably, in chessgames.com, in their database, black scores a higher percentage of wins than white with this variation, and Fischer only ever lost with it once, to Boris Spassky in the 1972 World Championship match, when the latter uncorked an opening novelty he devised with a team of Russian grandmasters, if the stories are true. Anyway, to get back to the game continuation, bishop e7 is what Fischer played. And Keres continued with queen f3. Now came queen c7, Keres castled long. Then came knight b d7 and bishop e2, about which Fischer writes, an innovation whose dubious merit appears on move 13, which is 3 moves from now. So now came b5, which is starting the minority attack on the queen's side. And Keres responded with bishop takes f6, giving up the bishop pair, slightly controversially, although this is all still part of his prepared variation. And Fischer recaptured in the correct fashion with his knight. If instead bishop takes f6, then bishop takes b5 is strong for white, especially if black accepts with a takes b5, because now knight d takes b5, and best play goes queen a5 and knight takes d6 check with a big advantage to white. G takes f6 is also possible, but white gets a strong attack after queen h5, knight b6, and a3, followed up with f5. So, knight takes f6 is the correct move for black. Now comes e5, which is discovering an attack on the rook at a8 from the queen here at f3, and now things are really sharpening up, and this is of course still part of Keres's preparation, and he's anticipated the strongest answer, bishop b7, because here he plays e takes f6, which Fischer writes is the crux of his prepared line. Any other move and black starts to get an advantage. For example, if queen g3, d takes e5, f takes e5, knight d7, queen takes g7, queen takes e5, and black stands better. So e takes f6, leaving the queen to be taken. So of course Fischer took it, and he wrote after this move, so I chopped it off. You know, he accepted the sacrifice and put the issue to Keres about proving his compensation for sacrificing his queen like this. And he mentions nothing of the massive complications he would have been certain to expect and have to solve over the board with his clock ticking after taking the queen, whilst Keres would have gone through dozens of variations in the line with his grandmaster friends in their own time. So, you know, he's putting himself at a disadvantage, but it's a confident way to proceed, because he's saying, well, even though you've done the preparation, I'm good enough to be able to beat it over the board in you know, timed conditions. So bishop takes f3 anyway from Keres, and so we can see here that at worst he'll have a rook and a minor piece against black's queen, because now black has 2 pieces on pre, the rook here at a8 and the bishop at e7. And it's still a tricky position. Playing black here, it's not obvious what the best way to continue is. Like, which piece would you save in this situation now? If you want to try and find the best move, then stop the video now. Fischer chose to preserve his bishop with bishop takes f6, and this both retains a small edge for black and avoids one of the traps that Keres had set. If instead rook c8, then f takes e7, and if queen takes e7, knight f5, and suddenly white is winning. Black's best bet now is to return the material, but his game will be losing when the dust settles after e takes f5 and rook a e1. If black now moves his queen, for example to f6, then knight takes d6 check, and white has a big advantage over 2 pawns, objectively speaking. However, there is a third continuation, which Fritz says is stronger than what Fischer chose. If we go back to bishop takes f3, the line that Fritz recommends is d5, and here best play goes bishop takes d5 and queen takes f4 check, with a good advantage to black, about a pawn up overall, and it's much better than e takes d5, because now knight takes d5 allows white to equalize. So it seems that both Fischer and Keres missed a continuation that was stronger than they thought, at least according to Fritz. However, there could be factors in these positions which Fritz cannot see, for example, likely endgame situations and table-based wins resulting from them. So for those reasons, I'm more inclined to trust their judgment over the judgment of Fritz. Okay, that's the end of part 1.